1847, Cedar Ridge, Texas. The kind of place where the wind carries more dust than hope, where every wooden porch has heard stories better left untold. It was a year of drought, not just in the land, but in hearts. And on one blistering afternoon, beneath the punishing sun, something happened that would change the course of 5 lives, and perhaps even the town itself. Old man McKinnon had always been known for 3 things: his luck at cards, his taste for whiskey, and the 5 daughters who followed behind him like shadows. But luck runs out, and debts don't forgive. By the time the sheriff nailed the auction notice to the courthouse door, folks in Cedar Ridge already knew. McKinnon had bet everything, and now his daughters were the price. It sounds impossible now, almost cruel to believe. But in that time, and in that place, women could be bought and sold as easily as livestock. They had no say, no voice, no protection. And so one by one, the McKinnon sisters were sold off to the highest bidder. Elizabeth, the eldest, was just 22 when she was purchased by a cattleman from 2 counties over. $50. No more than a steer. Mary Catherine, soft-spoken and sweet, was taken by a storekeeper who saw her as free labor. The twins, Hannah and Rebecca, barely 18, were claimed together by a saloon owner whose intentions were as clear as the whiskey he served. By the time the auctioneer called the name of the youngest, only one girl remained. 16-year-old Sarah Mae McKinnon. Her dress was threadbare, her shoes worn thin, but she stood straight, chin up, as if daring the world to try and break her. There was something in her, something unbent, even in the face of humiliation. The auctioneer raised his voice. "Strong girl, this one. Can cook, clean, tend a garden. Who'll start the bidding at 20? And the crowd began. It's hard to imagine now a girl being priced like a piece of furniture. And yet, it happened. Men tossed numbers like dice in a game, and no one questioned it. Because that was the world then. A world where silence was easier than standing up. But then, something shifted. From the edge of the crowd, a man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black like the grief he still carried. His name was Daniel O'Brien, a widower, a rancher, a man who had buried his wife and newborn son only months before. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bark a bid. He simply said, $100. The crowd fell still. The auctioneer blinked. "Did you say 100, Mr. O'Brien?" "I did. But not to own her. To marry her, if she'll have me." It was as if time itself had paused. He wasn't offering to save her as a possession. He was offering her a choice, a name, a future. He wasn't promising love. He was promising respect. And maybe that's what made it so powerful. Because in that moment, Sarah Mae wasn't just a girl on a courthouse step. She became something more, a symbol, a spark. Proof that even in the darkest corners of injustice, there can still be light. She looked at him, this man she didn't know, and asked the one question that mattered. "Will you treat me as an equal, Mr. O'Brien? Not as something you own?" And Daniel, without hesitation, gave her the one thing no man there had offered: his word. That moment didn't just end an auction. It ended a cycle. It challenged the silence. And for Sarah Mae, it was the first step towards something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope.
Sometimes the most life-altering decisions don't happen under candlelight or grand vows, but in the dust and silence of a town that almost forgot how to care. That was the case for Sarah Mae McKinnon, a 16-year-old girl who'd just been spared from being sold like livestock, and for Daniel O'Brien, a man who had already lost everything once, but chose to risk his heart again. The crowd hadn't even fully processed what had just happened. One minute, Sarah Mae stood on the courthouse steps, the last of 5 daughters to be auctioned off to settle her father's gambling debts. The next, a man, tall, grief-worn, but steady, had offered $100 and a promise, not to buy her, but to marry her. To offer her a name, not a number. No one saw it coming. Not the auctioneer, not the townsfolk, and not Sarah Mae herself. But she said yes. And within the hour, a simple wedding was held right there on those same courthouse steps, on the very ground that was supposed to mark her undoing. Reverend Miller, the town's elderly pastor, stepped forward without hesitation. There was no bouquet, no music, just words, a promise, a handshake, a beginning. Daniel helped her onto his black stallion, and together they rode away from Cedar Ridge. Neither of them spoke much at first. What was there to say between two strangers bound by necessity, not yet by affection? But the silence wasn't cold. It was cautious, respectful, a space neither tried to fill with false comfort. Daniel's ranch sat 3 miles outside town, modest but well-kept, a single-story house with a sloping roof, whitewashed porch, and windows that welcomed the Texas sun. Behind the house, a garden waited patiently for care, alongside a tidy barn that held a milk cow and 2 horses. Daniel showed her around without assumption, pointing out her room, the kitchen, the sitting area by the fireplace. He lingered outside the smaller bedroom. He said, "This was going to be my son's nursery. It's yours now, for as long as you want it." Sarah Mae didn't reply right away. She was still trying to understand what kind of man would offer space without condition. But in his voice, she heard something she recognized. Loss. The same kind that lingered in her own chest. The days that followed weren't perfect, but they were honest. Sarah Mae began rising early, her instincts shaped by years of tending to her younger sisters. She scrubbed the floors, learned the rhythm of the kitchen stove, coaxed milk from the cow, and restored the garden one weed at a time. It wasn't obligation, it was healing. For her hands, for her spirit. And Daniel, he didn't hover. He didn't command. He worked the land by day and left her space to find her footing. But every evening, like clockwork, he returned from the fields and sat beside her on the porch. Sometimes they talked about the weather, sometimes about their past, and sometimes they just watched the sun dip behind the prairie without needing to say a thing. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Sarah Mae noticed something subtle but undeniable. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to feel safe. And Daniel, he began to smile again. Not the polite smile he gave at the general store, but a real one, faint at first, then slowly deeper. A smile that reached the corners of his tired eyes whenever Sarah Mae hummed while cooking, or bent to whisper softly to the horse recovering from a sprained leg, or laughed, just once, when a stubborn chicken chased her out of the coop. It was in those little moments that something bigger began to grow. Not romance in the storybook sense, but something sturdier, something that had room for grief and space for hope. Neither of them had planned for this. He hadn't expected to marry again. She hadn't imagined freedom would come with curtains and clean sheets. But life, as they were learning, sometimes offers second chances in the quietest ways. Daniel never once reminded her of the money he paid, never treated her like someone in debt. He called her Sarah Mae, not wife, not girl, and certainly never mine. And that made all the difference. Because for the first time in her life, Sarah Mae belonged nowhere, and yet everywhere. Not because someone had claimed her, but because someone had seen her, not as burden, not as property, but as a person. A partner. And so, in the stillness of the Texas evening, 2 people, damaged, cautious, and brave, began building a life. not from grand gestures, but from shared dinners, quiet respect, and the unspoken understanding that healing takes time. But when nurtured, it grows. Just as Sarah May was beginning to breathe freely again, just as her hands had started to callous with purpose instead of pain, the past came knocking, in the form of a letter. It arrived one dry afternoon, carried by the town preacher who had ridden out to Daniel's ranch with a solemn face and dust on his coat. Sarah May took the envelope in trembling hands, recognizing the handwriting instantly. It was from Elizabeth, her oldest sister, the one who had been sold first, the one she feared she might never hear from again. Daniel stood silently nearby, his eyes steady but kind. He didn't press her to speak. He just waited. The letter was short, rushed, but it carried the weight of 100 screams. Elizabeth was safe. The rancher who had bought her had proven to be a decent man. He treated her with respect and had even asked for her hand in marriage. But that was the only good news. Mary Catherine, the gentle-hearted sister who once cried over injured birds and held Sarah's hand during thunderstorms, had tried to run away from the merchant who purchased her. He caught her and beat her so badly she could no longer walk without help. And the twins, Hannah and Rebecca, had been forced into work no decent man would ever speak of. They were being held upstairs in a saloon run by a man known only as Snake Morrison, where no one called them by name anymore. Sarah May's hands shook, her eyes blurred. For a moment, the strength she had built over the past weeks collapsed beneath the guilt and helplessness. She whispered, "They're still suffering, and I'm here, safe. Well, they're—" She couldn't finish the sentence. But Daniel did. "Then we'll go get them." She looked up, startled. "You mean that?" "I do," he said. "They're your sisters, which means they're my family now too." It would have been easier to stay, safer, more practical. But some things, some bonds, demand more than safety. They demand action. The very next morning, Daniel began preparing. He saddled 2 horses, packed food and supplies, and spent hours teaching Sarah how to ride on her own. She had never ridden before, not like this, not with a purpose. But Daniel was endlessly patient, guiding her hands, helping her find balance, on the saddle and in herself. They planned the route. Mary Catherine would be first. She was in immediate danger. The ride to Millerville would take 2 days through open prairie that stretched like an endless ocean. For someone who had never left Cedar Ridge, it might have been terrifying. But for Sarah May, it felt like breathing for the first time. They talked as they rode, about childhood memories, about loss, about the kind of life they wanted to build. She told Daniel about teaching herself to read using her mother's Bible, how she used to dream of seeing the ocean. He told her about leaving Missouri after his parents passed, chasing space and silence to outrun his grief. It was strange, this intimacy built not on years, but on shared purpose, on trust given without expectation, on choosing to carry each other's burdens simply because they mattered. When they arrived in Millerville, they found Mary Catherine sweeping the steps of the general store where her so-called owner worked. She moved slowly, painfully, as if every bone in her body had forgotten how to heal. But when she saw Sarah May, she dropped the broom and fell into her sister's arms, her tears soaking the dust from Sarah's dress. "I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered. Daniel stood nearby, watching quietly until the merchant, Prescott, stormed out, shouting, "She's mine! I've got papers!" Daniel didn't flinch. "I'll buy her contract. Name your price." "She's not for sale." "Then explain the bruises to the sheriff." It didn't take long. Prescott, facing Daniel's calm but immovable presence and the curious crowd gathering around them, reluctantly accepted $30, just enough to satisfy his greed without drawing attention to his cruelty.
Mary Catherine could barely believe it. She kept touching Sarah's hand, afraid she might wake up and find herself back in that store. But Daniel had already turned toward the next step, because the hardest part was still ahead. Hannah and Rebecca were waiting, trapped in a place where hope was the first thing taken and the last thing returned. But Sarah May had found hers again, and she wasn't leaving anyone behind.
When someone you love is suffering, distance becomes unbearable. For Sarah May, every mile between her and her sister Mary Catherine felt like a stone in her chest. The letter from Elizabeth had described it clearly. Mary had tried to escape, and for that she was beaten so severely she could barely walk. That image haunted Sarah like a fever dream. They reached Millerville on the second day. The town was small, but it pulsed with the weight of routine injustice. Women with downcast eyes, men with too much power and too little conscience. As they rode into town, Sarah scanned every storefront, every shadow, praying that she would see her sister alive. And then, near the general store, she did. Mary Catherine was sweeping the wooden steps, moving slowly, gingerly, favoring one side like every motion sent pain through her bones. Her face was thinner, bruised, her shoulders sagged under the weight of something far heavier than labor. But it was her, still breathing, still holding on. The moment their eyes met, Mary dropped the broom. "Sarah May?" she whispered, as if afraid the wind might steal the name away. Sarah dismounted in a heartbeat, rushing to her sister's side, wrapping her in arms that remembered what it meant to protect. Mary broke into sobs, clinging to her like a child who'd finally been found. That reunion should have been sacred, but it didn't last. Prescott, the merchant who had bought Mary Catherine, stormed out of the store like a dog whose bone had been stolen. He was thin, sharp-eyed, and wore arrogance like a badge. "What's going on here? That girl belongs to me." Daniel stepped forward, calm, collected, dangerous in the way only quiet men can be. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said, "but I'm willing to buy her contract. Name your price." Prescott sneered. "She's not for sale." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Then explain her bruises to the sheriff. Explain how a man with a legal contract ends up breaking bones and leaving scars." The crowd began to gather. Nothing riles a town faster than the scent of conflict. People peeked from behind barrels and storefront doors. They knew Prescott, knew his temper, but they'd never seen him cornered like this. Sarah stood beside Mary Catherine, holding her upright as if her own spine could lend strength. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply held the truth between them like a blade. Prescott, sensing the shift, recalculated. $30, he muttered. "I paid $20. I want profit." Daniel didn't blink. He reached into his coat and pulled out the bills. Money meant for supplies, tools, maybe feed, and handed it over without hesitation. The transaction was swift, hollow, but it changed everything. Prescott turned away, already pretending the girl had never existed. But Mary Catherine was real again now, free. Sarah helped her on the Daniel's horse, every movement careful, every wince from Mary a fresh reminder of the cost she had paid just to try and reclaim her own body, her own life. As they rode out of Millerville, Sarah glanced back at the town that had turned its face away while her sister suffered. No one stopped them, no one spoke, but some watched with eyes that might, just maybe, begin to see differently. Back at camp that night, Mary Catherine slept curled near the fire, wrapped in every blanket they had. Her breaths were shallow but steady. Sarah watched over her like a sentry. Daniel said nothing for a long time. He simply stared into the flames, his jaw tight, his knuckles white. "She's lucky you came for her," he finally said. Sarah shook her head. "No, she's lucky she never gave up hope." And then, softly, she added, "I don't know how to thank you." Daniel turned toward her. "You don't owe me thanks. You asked me to treat you as an equal. This is what that means. Your family is mine now. Their pain matters to me because you matter to me." It was a simple truth, but one that echoed louder than any vow. That night, under a canopy of stars too bright for the sorrow they carried, Sarah May realized something. Kindness doesn't just save people, it restores them, one soul at a time. They had found Mary Catherine, and soon they would go find the others. Some places carry a darkness that you can feel before you even see it. Dusty Creek was one of those places. a town where decency had long been traded for liquor, money, and silence. And at the center of it all stood a saloon that wore its cruelty like perfume, loud, lingering, and impossible to ignore. Inside that saloon, locked behind a second-story door, were Hannah and Rebecca, Sarah May's younger twin sisters. Girls who once braided each other's hair and chased chickens through the backyard were now prisoners, forced into a life no one had chosen and few ever escaped. Getting them out wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't even be safe. Daniel knew that walking in and demanding their release would likely end in blood. Snake Morrison, the owner, was known for two things: his temper and the men he kept close. Armed, loyal, violent. But every man, no matter how cruel, had a weakness. And Morrison's was routine. Every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, he left the saloon to visit the bank and check in on his other businesses across town. He always took his best gunman with him, leaving the saloon in the hands of a sleepy bartender and whatever drunks hadn't made it home the night before. That was their window. Daniel laid out the plan in a quiet room at the town's only respectable boarding house. Sarah May, Mary Catherine, still bruised but unbreakable, sat beside him, listening, thinking, memorizing every detail. Mary Catherine insisted on helping. "They're my sisters too," she said firmly. "I won't sit here while they suffer." The plan was risky, but it was their only shot. Tuesday morning arrived, quiet and tense. Dust hung in the air like a held breath. Mary Catherine made her way to the front of the saloon and collapsed, just as rehearsed, in a dramatic faint right in front of the steps. Her timing was perfect. The bartender stumbled out, followed by a few half-sober patrons. While the commotion stirred outside, Sarah May and Daniel slipped through the alley behind the building, entered through a back door, and crept up the stairs. Every board creaked like it might betray them, but they didn't stop. At the end of the hallway, they found the room. The door was locked, but old. Daniel broke it open with one well-placed shoulder. Inside, the twins sat on the edge of a narrow bed, pale and silent, their eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, no one moved. "Sarah?" Hannah whispered. "It's really us," Sarah May said, her voice breaking as she rushed to pull them into her arms. "We're getting you out of here." There wasn't time for long explanations. Daniel helped them to their feet. Their clothes were simple, worn, but they had enough strength left to move. They slipped down the back stairs, out through the alley, and toward the horses waiting in the shadows. But luck, like anything borrowed, has its limit. Just as they were mounting, shouting erupted from the saloon. Morrison had returned early. He saw them. "Ride!" Daniel yelled. And they did. They tore across the open prairie, hooves pounding like war drums, hearts thundering louder still. The twins clung tight to Sarah and Mary Catherine as they fled, dust blinding their eyes, fear hot in their throats. Morrison and his men gave chase, 6 riders against 3. They were gaining. Daniel looked back once, measuring the distance. They wouldn't make it. Not like this. The horses were tired, overloaded, and they were running out of space. But sometimes, mercy rides in when you least expect it. Just ahead, a group of cavalry soldiers emerged from the ridge. U.S. Army, from nearby Fort Davis. The officer in front, a young lieutenant named Collins, saw what was happening before a word was spoken. He rode forward, raising his hand. "This is now federal business," he called. "These people are under our protection." Morrison tried to argue, claimed the girls were his, showed papers as worthless as the man holding them. But Lieutenant Collins stood firm. "Unless you want to explain your actions in front of a judge, I suggest you turn around." Morrison cursed, but he knew the law wasn't on his side anymore. He turned back, defeated. Sarah May, Daniel, and the girls rode the rest of the way in silence. No cheers, no applause, just the quiet, steady rhythm of horses and hearts beating towards something long forgotten: freedom. That night, As they made camp beneath a canopy of stars, Sarah sat between her sisters, brushing dust from their hair, whispering lullabies from childhood like stitching across old wounds. Daniel watched from a distance, firelight flickering in his eyes. "What you did," one of the twins said softly. "Why?" He looked at Sarah, then at them. "Because family isn't just who you're born to, it's who you fight for."
Some stories end with a rescue, but the best ones, they begin there. After everything, after the auction, after the escape, after the ride through danger and dust, Sarah May and her 4 sisters stood together again. This time, not as victims of a father's deaths or the cruelty of strangers, but as survivors, as women who had made it through the fire and now stood on the other side, not untouched, but unbroken. Daniel's ranch had once felt quiet, a place for one man and his grief, but now it pulsed with the rhythm of 5 young women rediscovering what it meant to breathe freely, to speak without fear, to belong. Mary Catherine, once too weak to stand, slowly reclaimed her strength in the kitchen. She had always had a gentle heart and a natural instinct for comfort, and now she poured that into cooking. Warm bread, stews with herbs from the garden, pots of tea that never ran dry. Her food wasn't just nourishment, it was care, served 3 times a day. Hannah, the louder twin, found herself drawn to the horses. At first, it was just brushing and feeding, but before long, she was riding them at dawn, her laughter echoing across the fields. There was something about the way she moved around animals, with confidence, with ease, that reminded everyone she'd never been meant for confinement. Rebecca, always quiet, always watching, asked one afternoon if she could have needle and thread. Sarah found a box of fabric in storage, left behind by Daniel's late wife, and Rebecca got to work. She didn't just mend torn hems and sew new dresses. She began designing, creating, turning scraps into garments that fit like stories, each stitch a line of resilience. And Sarah? Sarah finally exhaled. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying everyone on her back. She had help. She had family. Elizabeth and her husband, the kind rancher who had bought her but treated her with dignity, decided to move their own homestead closer to Cedar Ridge, so the sisters would never be far from one another again. It was the first time in their lives that proximity wasn't a source of pain, but a promise of safety. The house, once too large for just Daniel and his ghosts, now overflowed with life. It wasn't perfect. There were days of tension, of tears, of old wounds reopening, but slowly they built something real. Each sister carved out her space in this new beginning. They didn't erase the past, but they chose not to be defined by it. What's beautiful about this part of the story is that no one rushed the healing. No one demanded smiles or forgiveness or forced cheerfulness around the dinner table. There was room for quiet, room for rage, room for remembering. And through it all, Daniel remained a constant, steady, gentle, never overstepping. He offered his land, his home, his heart, but never his control. The ranch began to thrive in ways Daniel had never imagined, not just because of the extra hands tending the fields, or the freshly baked bread, or the neatly mended clothes, but because of the laughter echoing down the halls, because of the mornings that started with singing and the nights that ended with stories told around the fire. The old place came alive again, and it wasn't just about survival. It was about joy, about ownership, not of people, but of their futures. Sometimes people ask what it really means to be free. It's not just the absence of chains, it's the presence of choice, the ability to say, this is mine, this is who I am, this is where I belong. That's what Daniel's ranch became, a place where 5 sisters could reclaim what the world had tried to steal from them: dignity, purpose, and sisterhood. And as for Sarah May,
The girl who once stood alone on a courthouse step, waiting to be sold, she now stood at the center of a home filled with hope. And she had only just begun.
Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up like a steady hand in the dark, a quiet presence at your side when the world has gone still. That's how it grew between Sarah May and Daniel O'Brien, slowly, gently, and without needing to be named right away. When Sarah first came to Daniel's ranch, she was not a bride in the traditional sense. She had not chosen love. She had chosen survival. And Daniel had not offered romance. He had offered something rarer, respect. In the weeks that followed, they lived as two people learning to coexist, carefully, kindly, without pressure. He made no demands. She offered no promises. But in that space of safety, something extraordinary began to grow. It started with small things. Daniel leaving a lantern lit for her when she worked late in the garden. Sarah setting aside a slice of cornbread for him at dinner, just the way he liked it. They began talking, not about grand ideas, but about memories, regrets, dreams that still felt too fragile to say out loud. One evening, as the first snow of the season fell quietly over the prairie, they sat on the porch, wrapped in wool blankets, watching the world turn silver. Sarah turned to him, her cheeks pink from the cold, and said softly, "I never thought I'd feel safe again. Not like this." Daniel looked at her, long and quietly, then reached into his coat pocket. In his hand was a small ring, simple but elegant, a delicate gold band with a small emerald set in the middle. He said, "It belonged to my grandmother. She wore it for 50 years. My mother kept it after she passed and then gave it to me when I married Catherine." He paused, eyes steady. But Catherine wouldn't want it gathering dust in a drawer. She believed things should be used, worn, lived in, especially love. Sarah's breath caught. She didn't speak right away. "This doesn't mean I expect anything of you. It just means I see you, that I've come to care for you in ways I didn't expect, and if you ever come to feel the same, I'd be honored if you wore it." For a moment, all she could hear was the wind in the trees. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the ring. It wasn't a proposal, not in the traditional sense. It was an invitation, a moment of deep trust, and Sarah, who had once been sold like property, was now being offered a piece of legacy, of belonging, willingly, freely, and with no conditions. She wore the ring on her right hand at first, uncertain of how to name the thing forming between them, but each day it felt more real. And then came the moment, quiet and unassuming, like most of their important moments. They were sitting on the porch swing, late at night. The stars were bright, the air crisp. Daniel was telling her a story about his childhood, about losing a bet with his sister over who could climb a tree the fastest and falling into a creek. Sarah laughed, a real, full laugh, the kind that sounded like it hadn't lived in her chest for years. When the laughter faded, she turned to him. "Daniel," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her, listening. "I didn't think this would happen. I thought I'd be grateful, respectful, maybe even content. But it's more than that now." She took a deep breath. "I care for you, deeply. Not just because you saved me or gave me a home, but because of who you are when no one's watching. I love you, Daniel." For a long moment, he said nothing, and Sarah began to wonder if she had misread it all, this quiet bond they'd built. But then he reached over and gently took her hand. His thumb traced circles across her knuckles. "I started loving you the day I saw you refuse to lower your eyes at that auction. And every day since, that love's only grown. I didn't think I had room left in my heart for something like this, but you proved me wrong." He smiled, not a wide, performative smile, but one that carried weight. "I love you, Sarah May, more than I ever thought I could again." They didn't kiss right away. They didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, the promise made, and in the quiet of that December night, two people, once broken by loss, now rebuilt by choice, finally met each other, not as strangers, not as survivors, but as equals.
There's something magical about a home that once held grief becoming a place where joy takes root. And for Sarah May and Daniel O'Brien, that magic arrived in the most unexpected, beautiful ways. One wedding, one promise, one heartbeat at a time. It started with Mary Catherine. The sister who had once been too weak to walk now stood tall beneath the cottonwood trees behind Daniel's house, her hand clasped gently in that of Dr. Marcus Webb. He was the young physician who had treated her bruises with care, but what truly healed her wasn't his medicine. It was his patience, his quiet admiration. The way he saw her not as someone broken, but someone worth rebuilding with. Their wedding was simple, like most things on the O'Brien ranch. A garden ceremony with wildflowers picked by the twins, fresh bread baked by Sarah, and Reverend Miller officiating once again. As Mary Catherine said, "I do," her eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from wonder. She had found love not in a grand romance, but in steady kindness, and that was more than enough. Next came the twins. Hannah and Rebecca, once shadows of themselves in a saloon room now long left behind, had begun to glow again. Their laughter returned louder than ever, echoing through the barn, the kitchen, the garden. They were still young, still learning how to live freely, but now they did it side by side with two men who saw their light and never once tried to dim it. The Morrison brothers, James and Caleb, unrelated to the notorious Jake Morrison, were ranchers from the next county, honest, funny, and fiercely respectful. They courted the twins the old-fashioned way, with quiet walks, heartfelt letters, and hands offered before assumptions made. Their double wedding was held just a month after Mary Catherine's, with half the town in attendance and twice the celebration. Sarah stood as matron of honor for all three of her sisters. Her eyes sparkled, her cheeks flushed with pride. A year ago, they had been scattered, wounded, silenced. And now, here they were, dancing barefoot under prairie stars, laughing like the world had never known how to hurt them. But perhaps the most tender beginning of all was the one stirring quietly inside Sarah herself. She hadn't said anything at first. She waited until the signs were too clear to ignore. The fatigue, the sudden aversion to morning bacon, the way her heart beat a little faster when Daniel placed a hand gently on her back. It was late spring when the truth was finally spoken between them, not with fear, but with soft awe. "I'm expecting," she whispered one evening, standing beside Daniel as they watched the sun melt into gold behind the ridge. He turned slowly, eyes wide, searching hers not for confirmation, but for meaning. "A child?" he asked softly, as though saying it too loudly might scare it away. Sarah nodded, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "Yes, yours, ours." Daniel didn't speak for a moment. He just pulled her into his arms and held her there, strong and steady, as the wind whispered through the grass around them. "I never thought I'd feel this again. Hope. This kind of hope." They named the baby before he even arrived, James Patrick O'Brien. It was Daniel's choice, and Sarah agreed without hesitation, not because she was trying to replace anyone, but because she understood what names mean. They carry weight, they honor the past, and they give shape to the future. James Patrick had been the name of Daniel's first son. the child he and his late wife lost before life could begin. But this James would grow up in a house full of laughter, sisters turned aunties, and the kind of love that was chosen, not owed. The house, once built for two, now pulsed with life. Babies would come, more stories would be written, but it all began with one girl standing on a courthouse step, refusing to lower her eyes. Now, that same girl was a mother-to-be, a matron of honor, a keeper of family and firelight. Because love, when it is real, doesn't rescue you, it rises with you and builds alongside you.
Some places don't just hold people, they hold legacies. And on the rolling hills just outside Cedar Ridge, there stood a modest ranch house that had once been little more than a quiet shelter for a grieving man. But over time, it transformed into something far greater, a living, breathing sanctuary for love, healing, and family. Sarah May O'Brien never intended to become the center of anything. When she first stepped onto that porch, all she wanted was safety, maybe a second chance. But what she ended up building was a kind of quiet miracle, one that rippled far beyond the fences of the land itself. The O'Brien Ranch began to grow, not just in acres or livestock, but in heartbeats. With the marriages of her sisters and their husbands nearby, and eventually with children of their own, the ranch became a gathering place, a weekend stop, a refuge when storms came, both the ones in the sky and the ones that lived inside people. There were always boots by the front door, always fresh bread on the table, always voices, young and old, filling the rooms with stories, questions, songs, and sometimes even tears. And at the very center of it all was Sarah. She wasn't the loudest, she wasn't always the one giving speeches or leading prayers, but her presence set the tone for everything. She had a way of seeing people without judgment, of reminding them of who they were even when they forgot. Sarah had learned, through loss and love, that what makes a family strong isn't perfection, it's grace. The ability to show up, to listen, to forgive. And because she lived by that truth, others followed. Her children grew up watching the way she moved through each day, how she worked in the garden with her sleeves rolled up and dirt under her nails, how she knelt beside the hearth at dusk, whispering soft hopes into the fire, how she kissed her father not out of duty, but with the deep comfort of knowing she had chosen him and he had chosen her. Each child carried something of their parents. Some had Daniel's calm, thoughtful gaze, others had Sarah's green eyes and quiet stubbornness. And as they grew, the house expanded too. More rooms were built, a bigger table, a larger barn. But no matter how many walls were raised, the soul of the home never changed. Because it wasn't about the square footage. It was about the people inside it. Neighbors came often, not just for help with cattle or weather updates, but for warmth, for the feeling they got when stepping onto that porch, knowing they'd be welcomed without question. The ranch became a kind of compass in the community, anchoring those who felt lost, offering shelter to those in transition. You might be wondering, what makes a place feel like home? Is it the building, the land, the memories? Or is it the presence of someone who quietly holds all the threads together without ever needing recognition? Sarah May never asked for thanks. She didn't need a title or a statue, or even a line in the town records. Her legacy was written in laughter echoing down the hallway, in the way her daughters carried themselves with pride, in the way her sons offered their hands first and their opinions second. Even Daniel, who had once believed his heart had no space left to grow, would often pause just to watch her from across the room, stirring a pot, mending a shirt,
hugging a niece with a scraped knee. And in those moments, he knew. That woman who once stood on a courthouse step, bracing herself for a life she didn't choose, had become the heart of everything. She hadn't just survived, she had transformed. She turned a place of dust and silence into a home that pulsed with purpose. She took broken pieces and didn't just mend them, she wove them into something stronger. The O'Brien Ranch wasn't perfect. There were still hard seasons, droughts, disagreements, farewells. But there was always something stronger holding them together, a quiet, steady love. And at the center of that love stood Sarah May. Not because she asked for it, not because she claimed it, but because she had earned it every single day.
When you look at her now, sitting on that old wooden porch with the late afternoon sun painting gold across her face, it's almost impossible to imagine where Sarah May O'Brien began. You wouldn't see the bruises time once left behind. You wouldn't hear the sound of an auctioneer's voice calling out a price on her head. You'd see a mother, a wife, a leader. But more than anything, you'd see the heart of a legacy built not from ease, but from courage. Sarah May started her story as a girl with no choices. 16, barefoot, standing on the steps of a Texas courthouse while her father's debts were paid with the lives of his daughters. 4 sisters had already been sold before her, and when her turn came, the crowd didn't hesitate. But one man did. Daniel O'Brien offered not money for ownership, but his name for partnership. He didn't rescue her like a hero from a tale. He gave her a chance to rescue herself. From that moment forward, Sarah May rewrote everything the world expected of her. She didn't become a victim of her past. She became the architect of a future. And that future wasn't just for her. It was for her sisters, for Daniel, for the children they would raise together, and for the generations that would someday carry their names with pride. Because what this story teaches us, what it proves, is that family isn't always something we're born into. Sometimes it's something we build, piece by piece, choice by choice. Love in Sarah's life wasn't something that happened all at once. It was slow, deliberate, rooted in respect. It grew not in grand declarations, but in shared silence, in everyday kindness, in choosing to stay when things got hard. And that love spread. It filled the walls of the O'Brien Ranch. It healed bruised spirits. It welcomed neighbors, raised children, and offered second chances. Years later, when her son James Patrick O'Brien sat beside her under that same wide Texas sky, he would ask the question most children eventually do. "Mama, how did you and Daddy meet?" And she would smile, soft, steady, and say, "Well, my darling, something wonderful happened disguised as something terrible, and that's how our family began." It's a line she repeated through the years, at bedtime, around fires, at weddings, and eventually at funerals. Because Sarah knew that life wasn't always fair, but it was full of possibility. Her story didn't erase her pain, it honored it. It didn't pretend there hadn't been sorrow. It simply refused to let sorrow win. In the end, Sarah May was remembered for everything she built afterward. She was remembered for the way she looked fear in the eye and didn't flinch, for how she offered love with open hands and never once asked for more than respect in return, for how she turned a ranch into a refuge, a marriage into a partnership, and pain into purpose. The O'Brien name became more than a family name. It became a symbol of strength born in silence, of dignity reclaimed,
of what happens when women are not only given freedom, but trusted to shape what that freedom looks like. Sarah May O'Brien never asked to be a hero. She simply chose to be brave. And because of that choice, an entire family tree grew strong, even in the rocky soil of hardship. Love rose from auction blocks. Joy bloomed in places once covered by dust, and every child who grew up on that land carried her story inside them like a heartbeat, quiet, constant, and true. So if you ever find yourself wondering if hope can come from ruin, if love can rise from ashes, if family can be chosen, not just inherited, remember Sarah May. And remember the truth she lived every day. Sometimes the most beautiful beginnings are wrapped in the most unlikely circumstances. And sometimes the greatest legacies begin with the courage to say no to what the world expects and yes to something better.